Thank you very much for having me here. I guess let me start with this, that I'm a big supporter of the Common Core. As Freddie mentioned, I helped write some parts of them, and I've certainly participated in various kinds of behind-the-scenes ways as these have rolled out. But that said, there are a number of critical things I intend to say in this talk, and that's why I wanted to point that out. I'm not a big critic of the Common Core, but I do have some basic concerns about whether we're going to roll these out successfully in our schools, whether these are really going to have the impact that we want them to have on our boys and girls. So with that as my introduction, let's just launch into this. And my focus today is really going to be on policy issues, sort of district-wide or statewide issues in terms of how these standards are implemented. In 1989, there was an agreement made between the National Governors Association and the White House. At that time, it was George H.W. Bush, 41, who was president, and the director of the education group for the National Governors Association was a fellow by the name of Bill Clinton. And they came to an agreement that essentially said that the governors were going to lead the national efforts on school reform, and that those would be standards-based reform efforts that, essentially each state would develop a set of goals, and all of their education efforts would move towards these goals and so on. And the federal government was going to help in that process. They were going to put out some models of goals in different areas. They were going to provide some support for the states to do this kind of thing. But the whole point was each state was going to have its own standards, and every state would work towards those standards in a real serious way. Well, that started out with I'd say a great deal of energy and enthusiasm on the part of the states, and in fact, in pretty quick order, all 50 of the states put some standards in place. Some problems came up with it. It wasn't like it was completely problem-free. Certainly one of the issues that came up was they found that a lot of states didn't have the infrastructure to really put high-quality standards in place, and so the Governors Association created its own little nonprofit group called Achieve, and Achieve's job or mission is really to essentially as an arm of the National Governors Association, to essentially serve the states and help them to put standards in place, obviously not just in English language arts, but in education generally. And so that was the structure that we were operating under. States were going in every so often and reforming their goals. States were putting tests in place with their goals and so on. That all kind of proceeded incrementally like that until 2001. In 2001, the federal government essentially embraces standards even more than they had in 1989. George W. Bush, who'd been a state governor and who had prided himself on his accomplishments in education, wanted to essentially put a major education supporting legislation in place, and that's where No Child Left Behind comes from. But it's not an anti-standards law, but it essentially said that states were going to essentially lose some control over their education system if they didn't, and certainly of federal dollars, if they didn't meet their own goals. And the notion was that it would give states incentives to step up to the plate if they hadn't been meeting the goals that they'd set for themselves. It would sort of renew their enthusiasm and their commitment, which makes a certain kind of sense. Unfortunately, it didn't actually work out that way. Instead of states saying, wow, we want to hit these goals, let's see if we could put more resources into education or give our teachers and principals better professional development or other kinds of support, more than 30 of the states figured out that they could meet their standards most easily if they just lowered them. And some of them did it in reading and some of it did in math and so on, but the fact is a number of states, in fact during those years, one state raised their standards, 33, I think, lowered their standards, and the rest sort of left everything like they were. Not our finest day as educators. The state's policies on this should be an embarrassment to all of us. Given that states were essentially racing to the bottom, gee, I want to make sure this federal money keeps coming in, so why don't I just make it easier for my state to meet the standards? If we had to do it through teaching, that would cost us a lot of money and time, and it would really be tough. And so that's sort of how that played out. Well, that's what really led to these discussions about having more of still a state response to this, not a federal response, and yet a coordinated state response, one where instead of having 50 people running in 50 different directions, the idea was that you'd get as many of the states together under the same roof, setting their own standards, but setting them collectively so that instead of everyone trying to make sure that nobody was doing better than them, by just through artificial means, they essentially agree, to try to come to some common agreements, and they stayed, frankly, they stayed to reading and math and writing and so on, the most basic of our subjects, for good reason. If you want to get absolute, widespread agreement on what it is that boys and girls need, I think you can probably get more agreement on that than you will on science or history or any number of other subjects. And so the notion here is that the National Governors Association is going to lead this effort together with the Council of Chief State School Officers, who hadn't been a big player in the early 1990s. Doing this not with state money, doing this with Gates money. Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates donated some amount of money, I don't even know how much, but a lot of money, to essentially pay for this effort. And again, I want to stress this isn't an educational issue, but it's starting to become a bit of a political issue around standards, that these aren't national standards. These aren't standards that came from the Department of Education. They're not standards that Barack Obama embraced or sent out or some such thing. They're not standards that the states did with federal money. They're standards that the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers did with Gates Foundation money, and of course with the approval of the governors from these participating states. And initially there were 48 participating states, so a pretty wide swath of the American political leadership. Though the federal government played no role in the formulation of these standards or in the development of these standards, once the effort got going, before the standards were completely written, but once the effort got going, then in fact the Department of Education did jump in with certain kinds of supports and certain kinds of enticements. And let's just touch on these for a moment. One of the things that Arne Duncan pledged was that he would put it into the race to the top competition, where states were competing for extra education money, that essentially if they adopted these new standards, the department essentially said it would take that as a sign that the state was really trying to raise the educational goals for their kids, and therefore they would give a state credit for that in that competition. And to be perfectly fair, there's absolutely no question that there were states that clearly adopted these standards more quickly than they would have, or by a different process than they might have, because of the enticement of that possibility of added funds. You have to remember the economic state of the country at the time when this was done, and so that's absolutely true. But I would also point out to everybody, and there were also states that have adopted these standards that never participated in the race to the top competition, or that actually adopted these standards after the race to the top competition had completed, and that it didn't appear that they could actually get any kind of financial advantage out of it. So it's certainly true that there was that federal incentive, and it certainly must have had some kind of an impact on somebody, and yet there's also evidence of states that clearly did not respond to that enticement, that clearly wasn't their motivation. It couldn't have been in their circumstances. Additionally, the federal government put up $350 million for the development of tests that would be consistent with the Common Core standards, and that's where the PARC and the Smarter Balance Consortium come. And it's also this distinction that I'm making is also why some states are signed on to Common Core because they see it as a state effort, but some of those same states are saying, but we don't want to be part of the testing because they see that as a federal effort since it's federal dollars. And so that's some of the kinds of political discussion that goes on around this. I do think that there are a number of states that suspected or maybe believed that if they were to adopt these standards, that sometime down the road that there'd be a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and that when that happened, there would likely be some kind of support in that for Common Core adoption or something along those lines. Of course, nothing like that has materialized at this point, and so some states, if they were thinking, there might be some federal dollars tied to this down the road, have probably been disappointed if that were the case. But I think this gives you some context to understand sort of how this came about and why this came about. I think that one of maybe the underlying point I want to make, the one major point I want to make, is I think that states have underestimated the size of the challenge that they've taken on. I think a lot of states quite I don't want to put a bad light on it. I don't think it was just chasing money and so on. I think they really did recognize that this was a chance to actually start moving education in the right direction towards higher goals rather than lower goals and so on. But I also think that as well-meaning as some of the states have been in that, and as scrupulous as I think some of the decisions have been, I also think that states have underestimated how big a challenge this is going to be. I think they've seen it as just, it's just a change of standards. We've changed our standards before, and it's true, most of the states had in the 1990s or in the previous last decade have gone through and reform their standards at least once in that period. But I think the Common Core is actually asking for such big changes that the states are not necessarily, or the feds, are putting policies or supports in place that are sufficient. And one of the problems with talking to such a large national group as I'm doing today is I recognize that you folks are from all over the country. The degree of response obviously differs by state, and some states do have some federal money that other states don't, and that certainly can affect their responses. But honestly, even in the states that are doing the best with this, even in states that do have considerable amounts of money to put into this, I still am looking and think even in those states, it's maybe not everything it needs to be, and certainly overall it isn't. I think that one of the reasons I support the standards is I really do think that they take us in the right direction, and do believe that if we respond to them effectively, our kids really will be able to do things like read and write better than they can today. And obviously everybody on the phone call wants to see that. And yet I also recognize that this is one of those things that we will not succeed with if we don't have sufficient policies and funding that actually support what we're trying to do. Before I sketch out what I think some of the shortfalls are, let me very quickly take you through what some of the big changes are that I think it requires, so that you'll start to understand why I think that the current efforts are maybe missing the mark a bit. There are big changes that are required in English language arts. I think there are in math as well, but we're going to stay to the ELA ones. Certainly a very big one is challenging text, that the Common Core is both asking us in grades 2 through 12 to teach children with texts that are at higher complexity levels or higher readability levels than texts have been in the recent past, that school books have gotten easier over the years, and this is really kind of trying to reverse that trend and say that kids should be reading not just better books, but harder books, more challenging books, books that put more demands on their language skills. Similarly, I think it's asking us to reduce the amount of out-of-level teaching that we do. We quite often, I have teachers tell me that they're teaching the 5th grade standards, but they're using 3rd grade materials to do it because the kids don't read that well. And Common Core is really saying, if you're doing that, you're really not teaching the standards. That it's not just the cognitive skills that the kids have to have, but they have to be able to show that they can exercise these cognitive skills in demanding contexts. And so if you put them into an easy context, it isn't really the same skill. Certainly there's a push to have more informational text in schools. This is one I don't feel like Common Core is leading on, but it is certainly a move that schools have been moving towards over, say, the past decade, and for lots of good reasons. But the notion of having kids spending more of their time reading texts that explore factual information about the natural and social world, as opposed to reading just stories or just poems and so on. Essentially giving kids a better mix of opportunity to learn. Certainly increased emphasis on what's being called close reading, but I feel just as comfortable labeling it as critical reading or deep reading or analytical reading. Actually getting kids to think about text at multiple levels and to spend considerable time really analyzing how texts work and what impacts that the author's choices of words and structure have, and having kids really critically analyze the information. Certainly greater attention to argument and evidence, not just stating one's opinion or giving an answer, but actually drawing on the evidence in the text. Certainly an important change. Similarly, more writing about reading, which again in some ways is the same kind of an idea, having the youngsters not just write about their own opinions or their own experiences, but having them write about ideas that come from the videos that they see or the books that they read or the experiments that they're engaged in, and then having them actually analyze that information and really again draw evidence from the text or from the situation. Freddie mentioned it in the intro, increased emphasis on disciplinary literacy, actually teaching kids to really do the reading of science or the reading of history, not in just sort of a general reading comprehension way, but in a sophisticated way, reading a science text the way a scientist tries to understand it, reading a history text the way a historian tries to understand it. And certainly an enhanced role of technology through in oral language and written language. It's infused. I think these are big changes. Obviously each one of these we could do a webinar on and spend huge amounts of time. I've just mentioned each, but I would argue that individually any of these would be a big change for our schools. Collectively, it's a huge set of changes, and certainly in the questions I can say more about those things, but I'm going to move on from there. There have been some independent cost estimates that some foundations have put out that I think are very helpful. Trying to estimate how much it would cost the states to actually implement the standards. And while I think these cost estimates are helpful, I also think they're in some ways misleading because I honestly think they're wrong. I think the costs of implementing this whole package are lowered a bit by the Gates Foundation paying for the creation of the standards in the first place, and I'm sure the states appreciated that. And certainly the cost is lowered a bit by the federal government paying to design the test instruments, because that's a big cost that states have had to bear themselves in the past, and to be able to shift that over to the feds is much appreciated. But despite those costs being shifted away from the states, frankly, I think the actual implementation of this of these standards is much higher than that, and I think a lot of states either haven't understood that, or maybe that's starting to dawn on them. They certainly haven't necessarily moved those kinds of funds. Now, the two estimates that I'm aware of, one done by the Pioneer Foundation, which is a fairly conservative group that isn't terribly supportive of the standards, they've estimated that it would cost about $16 billion collectively for the states to really get these in place. And the Fordham Foundation, which is a little bit more of a centrist group, and I think probably a bit more respected in the education community itself, they've got a much wider and a somewhat lower estimate of $3 to $12 billion. The problem is, one of the problems is with both of these estimates is that while they've both, I think, done an honest job of trying to figure out what this would cost, they've quite intentionally left certain costs out of it. So, for example, neither of them even attempted to figure out how much technology you would need either to really fulfill the standards so that kids, for example, could work on a word processor and edit their text that way, or so kids could actually read text on a cell phone and interact through instant messaging and all that kind of stuff. But then there's also just the sheer costs and the need for bandwidth and so on to even test kids in the ways that they're to be tested. And so there's absolutely no doubt that those things, some of those pieces are in place, but a lot of them aren't. That would add really several $billion to each of these. And I also think there's some estimates that are important to the folks on this call, but that aren't necessarily included in these estimates either. And again, not because anyone's trying to mislead you. I think they honestly they haven't thought it through thoroughly and don't really understand how connected various policies are. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Some of these they do talk about, and some of these they don't. But certainly one of the costs that I think is going to be much higher than either of these estimates, and probably higher than most of the states have estimated, is professional development. The additional training that our teachers, both in service and pre-service, are going to need, and our principals are going to need, I think those costs are probably more substantial than what's been estimated. Pioneer estimated higher costs than Fordham did, and the reason for that difference was Fordham believed, and I think quite rightly, that many states already have fairly large commitments to professional development in their states. They have certain staff members, or they have certain kinds of training networks, or they have certain kinds of information that they even put out over the internet. And shifting to put out information about Common Core versus what they've been putting out about ELA are probably pretty modest charges. It's not going to change the cost of that, say, to the state of New York, if it's just different information in the pipe. So clearly, taking existing costs and devoting them to Common Core is something that has to happen. It's something that states are already doing across the country, and that certainly is not an added cost due to Common Core. However, what I would say to you folks is that the actual costs of professional development in this area are much more extensive than what these folks are estimating. If you look at how they talk about professional development, I think they believe this is going to be very similar to the costs that most states have faced when they've reformed or edited their previous standards. Essentially, it's sort of the cost of getting information out to people so that they know about the new standards, so that they know about the big changes that they're being asked to make. And then I think the assumption is, and then the teachers will know what direction to run, they'll know what they're supposed to do, and it'll all be fine. The problem with that is I think they're both overestimating what the education community, what our skills are and what we know, and also I think they're underestimating the size of the changes that are called for by Common Core. Let me just give one example out of that previous list. I talked a bit about challenging text, and given that Freddie's the one who invited me to give this presentation, I would say to you that I think challenging text is extremely important for kids learning. I think it could be a real key to raising achievement. And yet I also am well aware that for the last 50 years we have spent considerable amounts of money training teachers and putting technology in place that's aimed at making sure that children, as many children as possible, are being taught from texts that are at their instructional level. That our workforce, our reading coaches, in fact, especially our reading people who have substantial knowledge, they know how to test kids to find out their levels. They know how to find book levels. They know how to get kids matched up with the right text. What they don't know, and what there isn't, this isn't, we just have to start implementing this. We all know how to do it. Moving forward, we're actually going to have to start teaching people how you teach children from text that's harder than we've used in the past. If we don't do that, I think we're going to find various scenarios. One scenario is the teacher will have harder text in her classroom. She'll assign it, and the kids will either not read it or will pretty much read it mindlessly because they won't quite know how to make sense of it. That's a problem. We have plenty of teachers who, in fact, this has been documented in past times when text has gotten harder. What teachers often do is read the text to the boys or girls, or just tell them what it says. Neither of which is going to teach kids to read. It'll get them the information from the text, but it won't help the kids to learn to read. And so you look at that and say, well, gee, how are you going to tell people to do that? Well, you can't just tell them. You're going to actually have to show them. You're going to actually have to guide them into it. They're going to have to know how to look at a text and identify what's going to trip kids up. They're going to have to know how to recognize whether those things really are barriers to kids' comprehension. And they're going to have to know how to help kids to get over those barriers without telling them what the text says. And that's going to take training. That's not going to be, we can do some kind of a webinar and now everyone will know how to do this. This is going to take people sitting down in rooms with children and trying things out and getting coaching and so on and so forth. A considerable higher cost than I think what the states have estimated. And obviously if you say, well, wait a minute, that's going to be true for disciplinary literacy as well for our history and science teachers and other technical teachers. And that's absolutely true. And obviously that you could say the same thing on the writing or some of these other areas. It's not that we don't know anything in the Common Core, but some of these really big changes are not going to be easy to make, and you're not going to get them to be made just by telling people to do them. It's a cost that none of these estimates have built into it. Teaching teachers to guide students to read more challenging text will require substantial investments. Teaching teachers to guide close reading is another big investment. There are models of this, things like junior grade books, but the numbers of teachers who know how to do that, who've been trained in those kinds of methodologies, are very small. And to multiply those numbers is going to take a real investment. It's an investment that some states are starting to make, but obviously more have to. Let's talk about another cost that hasn't been explored very publicly, and that has to do with assessments. These new assessments, I don't know if you folks have seen prototypes for Smarter Balanced or for PARC, but if you have, they've got to give you, great hope for the future that the tests will actually be getting at much higher level thinking than we've seen in the past, and really getting at kids' reasoning and requiring them to do some fairly complex tasks with their reading and writing. And that's all very exciting, and I'm very much on the side of that, and yet these are tests that are supposed to be delivered through technology and obviously prepared for through technology. Obviously, in the last decade, a number of school districts around the country have done more technology testing, map testing, and things like that. And so it's not that there's nothing out there. There are considerable amount of resources, and yet I can find at least as many schools that don't have those resources as do. But let's, the obvious cost there, and the one that's not accounted for, is, well, that means we're going to have to buy a lot more computers. And that's absolutely true. There'll have to be enough computers available just for the testing piece of this, so that large numbers of children can be tested over fairly brief periods of time. and then obviously if those computers in the schools, one would like to believe that they would be used for instruction throughout the years and would give kids greater access to the internet and to write-in tools and so on, and presentation tools, and that's all terrific. But certainly the schools that have gone through this transition to technology over the last decade also will tell you that they've often faced not big challenges in buying the machines, but big challenges in terms of things like bandwidth, in terms of things like having sufficient technical support. I mean, imagine if you're going to test a couple thousand kids this week and 25 of your computers go down. Do you have the skilled personnel there who are going to be able to either repair those quickly enough or bootstrap some other kind of solution so that the testing can go forward for all the kids, or you're going to have big problems. The bandwidth one is a really complicated one because, gee, if you want kids to jump onto the internet and read this particular passage, that's no big deal unless every kid in your state is doing that today, in which case it just became a really big deal, because even if you had a pretty good technical support set up before that, it could be that your kids are sitting there for 10 minutes waiting for the thing to download. I'm having a bandwidth problem on my computer at home right now the last couple of days, and man, I wander away. I can't just sit there. I imagine a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old. It's going to be a little challenging on that. One of the really big costs that I see in the Common Core is one that's not discussed in any of the materials that I've been able to find, or it's not been part of any of the policy discussions that I've been part of. If you think about it, we have a fairly extensive, maybe the most extensive remedial system in the world. Doesn't always work as well as we want, but in terms of effort, a very large percentage of our low-performing kids receive some kind of additional educational service beyond their classroom, whether that's a pull-out Title I program or a down the hall or a push-in special education program or an after-school program. I know certainly a lot of your states, a lot of your school districts have taken on RTI models a lot in the last decade and have been moving resources into that. In some ways, the Common Core doesn't change any of that. Those kinds of services are still going to be needed, the kinds of services that people have been trying to build. Certainly, we could always do more to raise the quality of those, and yet I don't think anyone would argue very much with the direction that those programs have tried to go. But let's think about this problem in just a real simple, maybe a simplistic way. The Common Core, I think, is generally acknowledged that it's harder than what states had been requiring before, certainly true for most states. Also, the PARCC and the Smarter Balanced assessments, it appears that they will be scored much more in line with, say, something like the National Assessment, where it isn't 80% of kids who are usually found to be doing well, but more like 48 or 50 or 52% of kids. And of course, there have been states like Kentucky and Florida that have actually done some piloting to score their state instruments as if they were Common Core instruments, that they were, the PARCC or the Smarter Balance tests. And what they found is, well, Florida's experience is a really interesting one. In past years, their kids were, I think 83% of their kids were meeting or exceeding state standards. Last year, when they tried to score their state test in a fashion more consistent with what will be the PARCC exam, it went from 82% down to 28%. Now, the reason I'm highlighting that is, imagine that you're a parent, and in the past, the school has told you that your child is doing fine in reading, that they're meeting and exceeding the standards. And, maybe you don't know a lot about education. You were satisfied with that. You're very concerned about your child, but if the school says he's doing fine, he's doing fine. And now all of a sudden the school is telling you that he's no longer doing fine. He's not meeting the standards anymore, that the standards now are really aimed at making sure that he's college and career ready, and he isn't. He's not on track for that. I suspect those parents are going to say, what can you do to help me? What resources are available? And telling them that you have a really extensive remedial program that's aimed at the bottom 15% or 20% of the kids in the district probably won't satisfy that parent very much. If failure rates on these tests are more like 50% or 75% or any of the kinds of numbers that we're hearing, and of course none of us really know, um, I think the pressure to provide additional remedial supports is going to be incredibly extensive. Parents from really low-income families often don't ask for these supports, but I promise you, families in middle-class families, families where the folks have some economic advantages and some sense that politically they have some power, they're going to be demanding help for their kids in various ways, and I think it's going to be awfully tough for schools not to provide that. And I think that the political cost to schools is going to be maybe unbearable if we don't provide for it. As I say, none of these analyses are assuming that we're going to have a lot more kids in need of extra help to meet standards, and therefore they don't budget for that. I think it's something states need to think through. Let me just, was there another point in there? No, I guess not. It'll come up. The states, again, are making big efforts in some cases not so much. There's some states I could slap their hands and say, you're really leaving your teachers exposed here and your children exposed. But there are states that are really, they've put their shoulder to the wheel and they're trying hard. Fordham Foundation is correct that most of the states are already spending money on professional development and instructional materials and technologies and assessments, and that shifting those costs over to Common Core is not a big deal, and it should be done, and I think it is being done largely. But some of these costs that I've laid out are costs that they didn't even consider in their analysis, or that they intentionally said they wouldn't consider because they didn't know how to estimate them. One of the things that I think Fordham is also correct on is they say that the states can actually pool some of their resources, that they don't have to bear all these costs themselves, that some of these things, the fact is, if multiple states are going after the same goals, they could put these in place for their they could go after some of these things in concert and cut the costs of them. And I think that's a great idea. In fact, I think it's one of the best things that comes out of the Common Core. So it used to be that every state was going at its own goals, and so every state felt uncomfortable in any kind of a consortium to plan or provide professional development or to set rules for instructional materials or to put any kinds of supports in place for certification or anything. Now that the states are sharing the goals, they're all trying to accomplish the same thing, it would seem like it would become natural to try to minimize the costs, say, of professional development, not by producing less of it, but by, in fact, taking the parts of it that are easy to share. So, for example, many states are doing informational meetings where they're trying to get information out about the Common Core to as many people as possible, and so they're having meetings around the state, and they invite in various experts. They might invite me in, and they'll pay someone like me to come in and maybe give a keynote talk at that, and so on and so forth. That makes great sense, except if all the states are doing that, it would make so much more sense if they, for example, instead of having everybody paying a speaker fee, what if you brought in one speaker and did it over the telecommunications, and had that person share not to one state but to 5 states, and if you multiply that across all the different kinds of information that the states are putting out, there'd be considerable savings that could then start to be used more locally by states, the part that they can't do in concert, when you really want to drill down and say, how are we going to get into schools? How are we going to give teachers enough coaching? How are we going to have teachers try this out and come back and get feedback on that? And instead of using the money for that, I think they're all in sort of traditional mode. Let's get the information out and spend money. And I'm watching states. Oh, did you see New York has a really good website? Right? Someone today was telling me Kansas has a really good website. Yeah, each of these states is developing their own Common Core websites at considerable costs that could be shared, and frankly, in some ways they're sharing the resource anyway. Costs are only part of this, however. Let me get the last idea up here before we open this up for questions. Part of getting Common Core in place is simply going to be, gee, you know, if our teachers don't know how to do something, let's invest in professional development to teach them. Gee, if our current instructional materials aren't sufficient to support Common Core, let's put purchasing rules in place to buy new materials that will meet these standards. Perfectly reasonable. Yes, those are going to cost some money, and they're probably reasonable investments to make. But actually, some of the what's in the Common Core actually makes some of our current policies outmoded. We could go through a bunch of these. We could go through textbook adoption policies or teacher certification requirements, where states are really, every state is on its own page about these things when it comes to reading and math and writing, and I would argue that makes no sense. But let me give you just one example of a state issue that this will fall more on some states than others. Some states have rules, for example, on things like graduation exams, that, you know, if the kids don't pass the state test or you know, some kind of a competency exam in 12th grade, they don't allow those kids a high school diploma. And, you know, we can argue over whether that's a good policy or a bad policy. Some states do that, some states don't. Some states do that in terms, or some school districts do that in terms of you take that kind of a test to determine whether you move, say, from 8th grade to 12th grade, or from, you know, 5th grade to over to the middle school. Those kinds of accountability policies that were put in place based on the kinds of testing that we used to do. Now imagine, you know, so you know, if in the past, if 80% of kids were passing your state test, and so you were holding back allowing kids to be promoted, or holding back kids getting a diploma from 18 or 17 or 20% of the kids, you know, that's a considerable challenge, and yet your states have done that and gotten used to that, and it's sort of baked in the cake in some places. But what if your new test is not going to have an 80% pass rate? What if it's only going to have a 50% or a 40% pass rate? What that means is, if that policy doesn't change, and I'm seeing situations where people aren't even thinking about those policies yet, they're not there yet. If that policy doesn't get changed, say, by your legislature, you're going to be flunking 60% of your kids, or 50% of your kids, or 70% of your kids. And that's not just a financial cost, I would argue. Now, there are some other kinds of changes as well. When I look at the federal government, which, as I've really stressed, that, you know, they're not the source of the standards, but they've certainly tried to be helpful in terms of the testing and trying to incent states to go into this and so on. But essentially, what we're not finding a lot of education dollars looking at Common Core issues very directly, and I hope that we'll start to get some help in that area. Oop, I didn't mean to do that. My point isn't that this is all going to crash down on us and fall apart and it's all a big disaster. My point is that if we don't make some of these changes, reallocate some of these monies, and actually start to think about these goals in a maybe a bit more humble manner, I think we could fail. But I honestly think that we're capable of doing this successfully. If we're going to, we've got to move faster, and we've certainly got to move bigger. These are big changes. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to give this back to Freddie so she can raise the questions from the audience, however that's being done.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was very, very thought-provoking, and I think you raised some really very, very critical points, and there are lots of questions from folks. So let's start with one of them. What do you think are some of the barriers? And do you think it would be possible in the timeline that we probably need to be acting in for some states to move in the direction of pooling some resources?
Yeah, you know, if frankly, you know, I think one of the biggest barriers is our past successes. Education in the press and in policy circles often gets wrapped, but the fact is we've maintained really high education levels, despite having really high poverty levels, going through gigantic immigrations and so on. Our literacy levels are pretty much where they've been for for 2 generations. I think that's a big accomplishment, especially in our the rural schools and the urban schools and so on. That so we need to. The fact is, we often have successes, and I think our successes in this case are tripping us up. I think, for example, I can't imagine that there aren't states where the state superintendent, calls in, whoever his curriculum staff is and says, are we going to be able to roll this out? And they say, oh, sure. In 2005, when we changed the standards, we rolled those out. We had a caravan around the state, and we did like 4 days, and everybody, all the teachers in the state from every school had a chance to hear some of that, and they all knew about it, and that was sort of their investment in it. I don't think they honestly understand that it won't. If you do it that way this time, you're going to fail. I think a lot of folks love to jump into issues like complex text and close reading without their staff actually understanding the standards. And you could do this at any level. You could say this is true of the teachers down at PS 54, and you can say this is true of the state education organization in whatever you think the most sophisticated state is. The fact is, folks don't necessarily, they want to get to the real substantive stuff, like I say, like challenging text, and frankly, what they really need is somebody has to sit down and read these standards very, very carefully and very thoroughly. And there's some good ways of doing that I've been suggesting, and I think other people are suggesting. I think you'd find a much better response and a much more thoughtful one. I think that the magnitude of it would be better if folks had actually done that and were doing that. I travel all over the country, and I'm finding audiences who start out telling me they really understand the standards, and within about a half an hour they're telling me they're kind of embarrassed that they don't understand them. So we clearly have some real basic work to do.
So it might also, I'm going to jump here to another question that kind of extends on this. So even though some states are starting to pilot test assessments, you're saying that it's going to take the lesson in your own state to see the results in your own state. I mean, people are believing maybe Kentucky has a very good reputation for the reform that they've done over the last 15 years. Mm-hmm. And we see here, I've put the data for, what happened on this Common Core-like assessment. I mean, are there some lessons, and are any of the states heeding those lessons?
Well, I mean, I think, I love states like Kentucky that have managed to, honestly raise literacy levels in their state. They're not the only one, but they're one of the few, and, I admire them, and it's really wonderful. But I think, as you say, they've been, working real hard trying to get some assessments in place before Park and Smarter Balanced come online. I know they've invested a lot in instruction, but boy, oh boy, what I see all over the country is people come to the testing so quickly, and what we really need their attention on is the teaching. What goes on in these kids' day-to-day lives is what matters most, and folks trying to come up with the best way to measure this is what's that old saying that it doesn't matter how often you weigh the pig, it doesn't add anything to its weight. That's not how farmers work. You can't just keep weighing them. We need good assessments, and I think the new assessments that are coming are really exciting, and yet, man, I wish I had that $350 million to put into teaching. I think we have to get our priorities in order, and so, for the states, Kentucky was kind of in a spot. They had, my understanding, that they kind of had to do those for some of their agreements, and they've been really smart in how they've done that through various partnerships, and if I were incenting them, I would have probably incented them a different direction and gotten them to do even more with their principals and their teachers. So, oops.
But in fact, the assessments in 2015, when those results come out, are likely to be the treatment for lots of states, from what you're telling me.
That scares me.
Telling us. And I mean, can we expect that some states at that point or even earlier are going to bail? And then what happens when we don't have a common assessment.
Yeah, well, there definitely are some states. I mean, just in the last 2 weeks, Alabama dropped out of the testing. They're not out of the Common Core, but they're out of the testing. And I'm not entirely, and there's certainly some other states that have made noises about that along the way. There's some, very big states that are, saying that they're definitely committed to Common Core, but they're not absolutely certain that they'll stay on board for the testing. The problem that they all have, of course, is No Child Left Behind is still in place. And it's certainly possible that the federal government could say, we exempt you all from this testing requirement, but I guess I don't see that happening. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think what that means is states are going to have to come up with some kinds of assessments for grades 3 through 12 to satisfy No Child Left Behind. Those assessments are going to have to be related to their standards. And that's a huge cost for states. I've worked on a number of state assessments, and the idea of states bearing that cost in these economic times, that doesn't seem very attractive to me. And so I think most states are actually going to hang in there. In fact, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if we get a few more states before the end signing on just because they don't want to make the investment in, locally. That said, I think some of these assessments are not going to be used the way that they're being designed. It was on one of the slides, and I didn't say it, but for example, these assessments very wisely are designing not just summative assessments that can be given at the end of the year for accountability purposes, but formative assessments that can be given earlier in the year so that a school can have a sense of which kids are doing well and where to sort of renew their efforts and so on. And I think that's a great idea, but of course states are going to have to pay for that. And I wouldn't be shocked to find states saying we're going to pay for the minimum amount of assessment that we can get away with. It's not that we're against formative assessment. We can't afford it. So some of the really cool stuff that's being designed might never even get into a classroom. And yet what you said is in a lot of ways the assessments will become curriculum for schools. I know states that are sitting on their hands saying we're not going to do much with our teachers until we see the assessments. You talk about teaching to the test and wanting to blame everybody else. It's not everybody else, it's us. When we do that kind of thing, we're the ones saying we're willing to just teach the test. We're not willing to work on trying to make sure that our kids are really able to write and read in the ways that we think that they should be able to. And that's something that I'm deeply embarrassed about as an educator. I don't think we ought to be saying that about ourselves, but I do think that that's what those practices do. I think teaching to the test in the sense of needing to see the test format and not what the test is designed to measure is a sure way to disaster for schools. I think it's served us badly in the last decade, and it's sure to serve us just as badly with these new higher quality tests.
So we've got time, just a very short response to this. You showed us 7 big changes, and you also described what if you had gotten the $350 million. Well, what would be your one priority if you could start a massive professional development that would serve the spirit of the Common Core?
To tell you the truth, if we've already trained teachers, they have some sense of what these standards really are about, so we've done that kind of thing. And I took one of the challenges on that list. I honestly would go after the one that I think has the chances of the biggest payoff for the kids in terms of their learning. I honestly believe that if we succeed with challenging text, if we literally start teaching kids from harder books and we actually teach them from them, we have the kids reading those texts, we have them analyzing those texts, we have them rereading them, to some extent we're dragging them through in some metaphorical sense. If we're really doing that successfully, I honestly think for the first time in 40 years we could see appreciably higher reading achievement in our population, and that would be, man, I'd love to see that. That would just be.
And I think we're going to ask you to come back and tell us how in fact you would do some of that instruction. So
I could show you how I would do some of that, but I would also, let me just put the other side of that. I also believe that it just raising text difficulty. I mentioned it in the talk that a lot of teachers, when text gets hard, they just don't use it. A lot of the kids don't read it, or they don't read it in the same way. If that's what happens, we could actually lower reading achievement.
Right, right.
And so
Well,
this can cut either way.
yes. Well, you know that this is something I've thought a lot about. And we want to tell you thank you very, very much. I want to let all of you know that the presentation slides are already up at our website. The recording should be up in at very least a week. I invite you to join us on the 26th of March, and we will open up registration 2 weeks before that. And we want to thank you very much, Tim, and also all of you who generously participated as audience members. And do send us your questions and inquiries. Thank you again, Tim. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thanks, Freddie.